Overlord Volume 9 Chapter 4. Massacre. Translated by Nigel. Edited, proofread by Deus Ex Machina. Part 1. The two armies formed their battle lines along the gentle slopes of the Crimson Plains, staring each other down. The awe-inspiring army of the kingdom was 245,000 men strong, divided into a left wing of 70,000 men, a right wing of 70,000 men, and a central column of 105,000 men, skillfully encamped throughout 3 hills. However, this encampment was not ringed by wooden fences, but formed of a gigantic mass of troops. The foremost 5 ranks of infantry carried 2-handed pikes, each one easily over 6 meters long, and they were formed up into a spear line. Their job was to substitute for an anti-cavalry fence in order to counter the heavy cavalry that comprised the core of the Empire's fighting strength. They did not use actual anti-cavalry palisades for a simple reason. Protecting that many people would require a ridiculous amount of wood. For a large army, it was better to make good use of a spear line. Although this formation was quite solid and presented many problems for any attackers, it had its weaknesses as well. Since the formation was dense and the weapons carried were very heavy, it was all they could do just to stay in place and prevent enemy charges. As such, they lacked the ability to react quickly to enemy maneuvers, and if the Empire used bowmen or magic, their losses would be heavy. Then again, not much more was expected from mere peasants. All that was required was that they deflect the first charge of the enemy. On the other side, the Empire had 60,000 men. Their numbers were vastly inferior to those of the kingdom. However, the Imperial Knights were relaxed, without so much as a hint of fear. They did not feel they would lose at all. This confidence came from knowing their own personal strength. Even so, it was a simple fact that there was a vast disparity in the military power of both sides. Although it would not be a problem if they could fight forever without fatigue, they were only human. Once they got tired, even the difference in their individual abilities would eventually be caught up to. The kingdom also had one more advantage, a large one. That was the value of each individual. Most of the kingdom's troops were composed of peasant levies. In contrast, the Empire fielded professional soldiers called knights. A peasant was simply expected to hold a weapon, while each Imperial Knight was carefully trained. Every loss by the Empire was more keenly felt than a similar loss by the kingdom. The Empire simply could not afford to squander their knights in foolish offensives or wars of attrition. Therefore, a pitched battle on open terrain like this was to the kingdom's advantage. Because of this, the battles fought between the Empire and the kingdom were typically minor skirmishes. The Empire's objective would be accomplished simply by pulling the kingdom's serfs onto the battlefield. There was no need to waste valuable human resources, and the kingdom knew this as well. This scripted pageantry was what passed for war between the Empire and the kingdom. Even if that magic caster called Ain Zul'Gan took part, it would still end in a minor skirmish. That was what most of the kingdom's nobles thought. After all, the Empire's knights were not just a military force, but a police force as well. They were the people who protected the safety of the Empire. Needless losses to them would threaten the Empire's stability. And so, the nobles awaited the Empire's next move. By tradition, the imperial forces would parade before the kingdom's troops, and then fall back. The kingdom would then sound a victory cry. This was how it had always been. However, the imperial army did not move. They had remained still ever since they had deployed from the fortress like castrum and arrayed themselves before the kingdom's forces. It was as though they were waiting for the kingdom to make the first move, or for something else. They're not moving. What's going on? This was at the headquarters where the king was. It was located behind a host of 105,000 men. Marquis Raven stood beside Gazef, speaking quietly as he surveyed the motionless Imperial Knights from the safest place he could find, an observation point atop a hill that was slightly higher than the others. If the Empire did not move, then neither could the kingdom. An attack by the kingdom now would be extremely foolish, given that they had already formed their spear line. Once the nobles had tried a preemptive attack on the Empire. However, the attackers had been slaughtered in short order, and the kingdom had suffered significant losses as a result. Ever since, the kingdom's preferred tactic against the Empire had been to form a spear line and prepare to receive a charge. Since the enemy was willing to retreat, there was no need for risky forays. All right, then. Looks like they're waiting for us. The final declarations have been made, so they should be joining battle soon. Warrior Captain Gazef Dono, do you have an idea on what the Empire might be waiting for? 30 minutes ago, representatives from both armies had begun negotiations in the central area between them. Granted, that was simply a statement of unacceptable conditions from both sides that was more of a stage play than actual arbitration. Its true purpose was to show that each side was compassionate and willing to avert war until the last moment. Of course, negotiations would break down, and that would be the signal for the fighting to begin. If they were following the example of previous years, the Imperial Army should have begun moving out immediately. However, this was not the case. They remained stationary. I have no idea. Do you know anything about this? As if. I'm not too familiar with military matters. I usually let my subordinates handle those. Somehow, the idea that the wise Marquis would know nothing about his enemy sounds like a lie. A lie. I did not expect you to be that direct, Gazef Dono. Did I give you offense? I apologize if I did. Ha, no, none was taken. You're much friendlier now than you were back then. Gazef's brow furrowed, as he sensed the barbs in those words. Ha, take it for what it is. It's a fact that I'm no general, and that's not a lie. It just so happens that one of my subordinates is a good leader of men, so I left military matters to him. Could it be one of the former adventurers working for you, the ones who became famous during the demonic disturbance in the capital? Ah, no. They're over there. Raven pointed to a group of 5 men standing together. Although they were all well into their middle age, and their strength was not what it used to be, they had been Orichalcum-ranked adventurers in their prime, and there was something about the way they carried themselves that made Gazef feel that he could not take them lightly. They will be my bodyguards during the battle. With men like these protecting you, Marquis Raven, I'm sure you will have no problems returning safely to the royal capital. Well, as long as they don't confront that great magic caster. Oops, I almost forgot. What about your strategist? I don't think you'll know him since he's a commoner from my domain, Gazef Dono. When a goblin horde attacked his village, he beat them off with a group of villagers half their size, and thus he came to my attention. Ever since, I've entrusted him with the command of my house troops and various other tasks. The big surprise is that he's never once lost a battle. I also gave him a high-ranking position as my aide. I'd like to see this commander that you praise so highly, Marquis Raven. If he's really everything you say he is, we might do well to give him command of the kingdom's armed forces. If you gave it to him, gave him complete command of the military, and the royal army moved together under his command, we might be able to fight a battle which makes our neighbors sit up and say, the army of the Riesti's kingdom is not to be underestimated. Gazef exchanged a look with Raven, sighed, and then smiled tiredly. The nobles would never allow a commoner to rise to such a station. It's nothing more than idle fantasy at the moment. Certainly not while the nobles are divided into their factions. The empire organized its legions by appointing a general over each one, under whom served division commanders, brigade commanders, and other officers, all in strict regimentation. In contrast, the kingdom's armies were composed of the house troops and levies each of the kingdom's nobles could muster. The king was the overall commander, but each host would act as they or their faction saw fit. Simply put, it was a ragtag bunch of misfits. Although Gazef had the title of warrior captain, in the end, he was only the commander of the warrior band which was directly loyal to the king, and he had no authority to give orders to the nobles. While it was possible for the king to order the nobles to listen to Gazef, the nobles had always disdained Gazef the commoner, and doing so would sow the seeds of future grudges. The king was aware of this, and so he ordered that Gazef would do no such thing. The two of them considered their places in the kingdom, and sighed heavily. Then, they exchanged looks, and laughed. This conversation should have been had elsewhere, not on the eve of the clash of swords and the spilling of blood. Even if we return home alive, there'll still be a battlefield waiting there. Isn't that what being a noble's all about? After this is over, I'll petition the king to raise you to nobility. It angers me that someone who calls himself the king's sword doesn't engage with noble society as eagerly as he should. Although Raven looked like he was joking, Gazef could tell from the light in his eyes that his anger was sincere. When someone skilled at hiding their feelings revealed them to oneself, it would be a cause for celebration. However, it was a different matter if it was not a positive emotion. Gazef quickly changed the subject. Let's leave that aside for now. Why don't we bring that strategist Dono of yours over, and hear his opinion? Calling him over will be difficult. After all, I entrusted him with my base camp. I don't dare move him unnecessarily while we don't know what the Empire's up to. Although the nobles had all pledged to work together for the kingdom, in the end, Raven's holdings were still his top priority. It was only natural that he would refuse. It's the same thing as always, but I dislike the tension in the air. While I don't actually want the Empire to attack us, they should hurry up and do it if they're going to, and spare us the anxiety of waiting. Gazef could sense the unease from the kingdom's army. As he tried to see where it was coming from, he furrowed his eyebrows. I see. When you think about it, this might be an imperial strategy to get us anxious before they make their move. It's difficult to coordinate and control so many soldiers, so even the slightest flinch in any unit could be magnified into a great disruption at the end. A large group is difficult to attack, but once the individuals break from the pack and runs, they'll be easily hunted down and killed. It's the same principle animals use for hunting. A surprised Raven followed Gazef's line of sight to the worried-looking troops on the left flank, and then realization dawned on his face. That looks like they're rotating the troops on the inside to the front line. We wouldn't have to worry if they were just reorganizing their formation. That's Marquis Bolrobi's flag. Looks like the left wing's commander is moving himself to the front. The kingdom placed the noble faction on both wings, while those of the royal faction were concentrated in the middle. King Ranposa III was the overall commander of the central column, while Marquis Bolorobe commanded the left wing. Moving one's command to the head of the formation is quite strange. Do you see, Gazef Dono? The Marquis is moving those elite troops who are directly loyal to himself. His plan is to distinguish himself in combat against the individually powerful imperial knights, under the eyes and ears of the gathered nobles. That way he'll make a reputation for himself as the lord of the strongest unit in the kingdom. Raven cast a challenging look to Gazef. Will you let someone else gain greater glory than your beloved warrior band? It seemed to say. Gazef did not take the bait. The warrior band's duty is to protect the king. We won't move without the king's direct command, even if the Empire sounds the charge. There is no greater duty for us than ensuring the safe return of the king to the capital. Gazef tapped the sword at his waist. Still, it's possible that I might deploy by myself to blunt the enemy's attack. That's one of the 4 treasures of the kingdom, Razor Edge. I see. Marquis Raven stepped back, and studied Gazef from top to bottom. The gauntlets of vitality, which negated fatigue. The amulet of immortality, which let him regenerate his wounds. The guardian armor, crafted of the hardest metal known to man, adamantite, and enchanted with magic that deflected lethal blows. And finally, Razor Edge, a magic sword crafted in pursuit of absolute sharpness, which could carve through enchanted armor like the proverbial hot knife through butter. Now that you're fully equipped with all these treasures, you are the kingdom's greatest treasure. I heard once that the kingdom actually had 5 treasures, but it seems they had all been gathered from the start. Gazef blushed as he was compared to those treasures, even though he knew it was just flattery. Ah, give me a break, Marquis Raven. The king is far greater than I am. His Majesty knew what it would mean to entrust these things to a commoner like me, but he did it anyway. That's a reasonable opinion. Honestly speaking, I once thought that it was foolish to announce that he'd be handing them over to a commoner, you. All that would accomplish was to make more people leave the royal faction. However, now that I'm standing beside you on the battlefield, I can't help but think that it was a masterful move. You really are too selfish. If only I could live up to your expectations. Gazef looked out at the serried ranks of the Imperial Knights. He did not think there were any strong opponents in the Empire besides Triarch's Fluido Paradigm. Now that he was equipped like this, he even dared harbor the faint hope that he might be able to defeat Fluida. On the other hand, he did not feel like he had any chance of defeating Inzuyugaon. He could not even imagine the possibility. No matter how hard he tried to think positive and consider how things might go in his favor, the only thought that came to mind was of himself being instantly slain by the mysterious magic caster. What's wrong? No, nothing. He knew he was the greatest warrior in the kingdom. Allowing himself to appear weak would only lower the army's morale. Ah, no. I was just feeling sorry for Prince Barbaro. Feeling sorry? Could it be? I see. Is that so? Gazef Dono, you also feel. I see. What are you trying to say? I mean, don't tell me you feel that the king sent the prince to Kugane village so he could not distinguish himself. Is that not the case? Raven smiled thinly. Far from it. I feel that His Majesty has truly placed his trust in you, Gazef Dono. Marquis Raven decided to explain when he saw that Gazef did not understand at all. Given that the king's most trusted warrior captain was supremely wary of the opponent called Inzuyugaon, it was only to be expected that the king would be on guard against him as well. The king did not want to risk his beloved son in battle with an unknown quantity like that. So he wanted to send him to a safe place, even if he would only be able to make some minor accomplishments there. Although, to be honest, the old me would have been upset by the way the king was only concerned with his son when so many other people had sent their children to the battlefield. Raven smiled in a fatherly manner. Of course, I understand why he did such a thing now. I'd have done the same to ensure my son's well-being. Ah, Marquis. That's a very fatherly thing to say. Raven smiled. Gazef felt that it was quite unlike him, which was itself a fairly rude thought, yet his smile was equal parts kind, happy and proud. Well, I am a father, after all. I promised my son that, after this battle's over, I'm going to play with him as much as he wants, like a normal father. Oh, we've gone off topic. Let's leave things at that. Although, it seems Prince Barbaro doesn't quite understand the king's point of view. It feels a little sad how the father can't get his feelings across to his son. Gazef agonized about how to answer him. It was hard for him, who had no children of his own, to put himself into that mindset. Right. By the way, is it possible that they might launch a sneak attack on Irantal with a separate force? Although it would be frowned upon, they might do anything to win. Gazef thought that the topic change was incredibly forced, but to his surprise, Raven ran with it. It's not an easy matter to attack Irantal, defended as it is by its 3 layers of curtain walls. Even if the Rima and 2 legions of the Empire mobilized in full, it would be a difficult task for them. My strategist also says the enemy wouldn't do such a thing. Is it? What if they had flying beasts, or a secret legion of some kind? It's still not possible. Ultimately, it's very difficult to take control of a city with a small number of men. Speaking of which, Gazef don't know. Do you know the conditions required to completely dominate Irantal? Gazef shook his head. One needs to face the kingdom in open battle and gain an overwhelming victory. If the aggressors barely manage to triumph, governing the conquered populace will be extremely difficult. The citizens won't respond well to the invaders and there'll definitely be a resistance movement. So even if the Empire used a separate force to attack Irantal, as long as our soldiers are untouched, they'll immediately take back the city. As such, the Empire needs a total victory. With that, the citizens will be frightened to the point they can't even think of resisting, and they won't be able to mobilize troops. The important thing was that the Empire had to win here. In addition, they had to achieve a victory so complete and absolute that none of the surrounding nations, in particular the kingdom, which could instantly deploy its troops to take the city back, would dare think of making a move. Suddenly, Gazef had the feeling that he had put all the pieces of the puzzle together. However, the picture they formed was beyond his comprehension. A vaguely distasteful feeling tormented Gazef. What's wrong? Gazef don't know. No. Gazef wanted to tell Raven about the scattered pieces of the puzzle that he had managed to sweep together in his head. He believed that Raven, with his superior intellect, could extract insights from him that he could not. However, at that moment, the Marquis turned back to the Imperial formation. Gazef don't know. It seems they're making their move. The Imperial army parted in 2, to make a path. As Gazef was wondering if they were planning to attack the left and right wings of the kingdom's army, he saw an unfamiliar flag rising into the air. It was a flag that Gazef had never seen before, adorned with a bizarre crest that belonged to neither the kingdom nor the empire. The group nearing the flag advanced. All eyes were on that company. And then, Gazef's heart ran cold with terror. Raven, who was standing beside him and saw the same thing he did, swallowed loudly. Knowing that he was not alone in his feelings, bitterness began rising at the back of his mouth, and his heart pounded madly. It was a bizarre army. What appeared was a group of roughly 500 riders. It seemed entirely insignificant compared to the 2 armies facing each other down. However, those troops were highly abnormal. They seemed to radiate an oppressive air that he could feel even from so far away. It stirred up Gazef's memories from his time in Kugane village. There had been a knight-shaped monster back then, which Ains said he had created. There were roughly 200 of them now, warriors bearing massive shields and clad in spiked armor. The rest were similarly inhuman soldiers, but they wore leather armor, and they were armed with axes, pikes, crossbows or similar weapons. If the former were knights, then the latter could be called warriors. But whatever they were not humans. They were monsters, down to the marrow of their bones. And then, those monsters rode monsters of their own. Said creatures were beasts of bone, with flickering mist in place of their flesh and blood. The fog sparkled everywhere, pus yellow and emerald green. Goosebumps sprouted all over his body. This was bad. This was very bad. It was a vague statement, but Gazef simply did not have the words to describe the situation more clearly than this. So the Empire has enlisted monsters into their ranks, it seems. This is quite surprising. It's made me break out in goosebumps. No. No, Marquis Raven. That's not the case. What the Marquis feels now, what fills your body with said goosebumps, is definitely not surprise. Then what would that be? Seeing that Raven was completely baffled, Gazef answered curtly. It's the fear of death. It's triggered your basic survival instinct. Turning his eyes from the visibly shaken Raven, Gazef looked at the Imperial army. The horses are shying. Even these trained, hardened war horses are so frightened they can't move. What are they? A secret division of the Empire. Impossible. Those monsters are not things that humans can control or use. Gazef knew nothing about the true identity of these monsters, but his warrior's instinct supplied enough information for him to speak conclusively. There's no doubt about it. They must be the Knights of Ainzu Gaon. Is that the army of the magic caster you feared? Marquis Raven, please gather the former adventurers immediately. Ask them what's our best move. They've fought many monsters in the past and survived. Please ask them to share their wisdom with us. He probably wanted to reply that he understood, but his bodyguards were faster than that, and had already moved up to protect him. However, that was only expected. They had sensed the power of this threat before Gazef had. Marquis Raven, the formerly Orichalcum-ranked adventurers rode over on horseback. Did you see it? Do you feel it? At the head of the adventurers was their leader, the paladin of the fire god, Boris Axelson. Within his voice was a thrill of fear he could not hide. Raven could not speak. Gazef understood why. There was a note of fright in the voice of an formerly Orichalcum-ranked adventurer, in a place defended by such a vast army. Gazef felt that this was no longer time for etiquette, and asked, "Tell me, what is that? No need to greet me. Please tell me everything you know, all of you." Boris clutched the holy symbol that dangled around his neck. It was a gesture of warding. "We can't be sure, but we believe the creatures they ride are legendary monsters known as Soul Eaters. They're said to be undead creatures that hunger for the souls of the living. According to legend, they once appeared in the middle of a continent, in a city of the Beastmen Kingdoms. Then, how many casualties were there?" The words Boris spoke sounded unnaturally quiet. 100,000. The breath caught in Gazef's throat. "They say 3 Soul Eaters appeared, and they destroyed the city. 95% of the populace, over 100,000 people, died as a result. The city was abandoned, and it was called the Silent City." A heavy silence fell on the group. "And there's 500 of them out there?" Nobody could muster up the strength to answer Raven. Gazef forced his words out to break the silence. "Like I said earlier, I find it hard to believe the Empire could subdue monsters of that level with their own power. Even that mighty magic caster, Fluda Paradine, shouldn't be able to do it." That means, he did not need to finish his sentence. Marquis Raven understood. Is that the power of Ainzu Gaon? Then, what manner of creatures are riding on those monsters' backs? The adventurers looked nervously to each other. "We don't know. The only thing we're certain of is that they must be very dangerous." "No, I apologize. I shouldn't be using such vague terms as dangerous. However, I can think of no other words to describe what we are facing now." Then what should we do?" Gazef don't know. In response to Raven's panicked question, Gazef replied tersely and clearly. "Retreat." They already knew that the enemy had prepared an awe-inspiring force. With that in mind, what else could they do but run? Advise the king to order a retreat. Gazef could not finish his sentence. That was because a masked magic caster stood at the head of the enemy. At his right was a short person in a hooded robe. At his left stood one of the Empire's 4 knights. Even at this distance, Gazef could not have mistaken that man for anyone else. Gaon. Is that the mighty magic caster, Ainzul Gaon? Is he the one who summoned the Soul Eaters? Him. Marquis Raven, we, the fearless warrior of countless battles, swallowed heavily, and continued in a lowered voice. What the hell are we fighting here? Ains waved his arm. In response, a magic circle sprang into existence, roughly 10 meters in radius and shaped like a dome. It was centered on him. The people on his left and right were engulfed by it, but they seemed fine. It would seem the magic circle did not harm allies. This fantastic sight drew everyone's attention, even if they knew this was an emergency situation. The magic circle glowed bluish-white, and translucent symbols appeared across its length and breadth. The sigils changed with kaleidoscopic speed, shifting between runes and letters that nobody had ever seen before. The kingdom's troops gasped out in surprise. There was no fear or tension in their voices, like they were watching a beautiful show. However, the ones with keener instincts started looking around themselves in obvious discomfort. I'm returning to my unit. There's no more time to waste. Ainzul Gaon's power is immeasurable. Doing battle with him was a mistake from the start. What we need to do now is minimize the number of casualties, and at the same time we need to get back to Irantal as fast as we can. Gazef Dono, please protect His Majesty. After that, retreat without delay. The calm which Raven had managed to cling to until recently was all gone now. Although I don't trust my abilities that much, but I will definitely protect His Majesty's person. Also, don't think about an orderly retreat. Of course. We'll retreat as fast as we can. No, we'll flee like rabbits. Then, I wish you well, Marquis Raven. The same, Gazef Dono. The 2 men who stood at the pinnacle of the kingdom's military might and strategic thought hurriedly flew into action. However, it was all too late. Nobody's there. After Ains deployed his magic circle, that was what he had thought. There were no players in the kingdom. YGGDRASIL's super-tier magic was incredibly powerful. Because of that, during a large-scale battle, bringing down a person who could cast super-tier spells first was a basic tactic. One could hamper one's opponents in many ways. Teleportation assaults, for instance. Bombardment from atop a magic carpet. Pinpoint shooting from extreme range. There were countless methods to accomplish that aim. However, no attacks like these came toward Ains. In turn, that proved that there were no YGGDRASIL players present. Under his mask, Ains smiled, a fact which went unseen by anyone. Of course, his skeletal face could not form a smile. The bitter smile, laced with faint traces of joy, highlighted the feelings in Ains's heart. So I don't need to serve as bait, then. His joy came from the fact that he had not met any players from YGGDRASIL. Ains could not be counted as the greatest among the players of YGGDRASIL. There were others who were better than he was, and his odds of survival against stronger players were not good. While playing, Ains's strength had stemmed from his knowledge. Although he won often in PvP combat, those were consecutive victories after forfeiting the first round of a match. Ains was surprisingly skilled at using the information he had gathered. Conversely, his chances of defeat were also very high if he fought an opponent he had never encountered before. Ains was fully aware of his abilities, and was deeply grateful that he had not encountered a powerful enemy that he knew nothing about. But at the same time, he also felt a hint of regret. He regretted the fact that he could not find the one who had brainwashed Shaltir among his enemies, people who were related to a possessor of a world-class item. Hatred, thick and cloying, pulled at the bottom of Ains's heart. Although his strong emotions were suppressed, the weaker ones persisted within him. Ains opened his hand, and within it was a miniature hourglass. If he used a cat item, he could immediately cast the super tier spell. The reason why he had not done this was because he was serving as bait to verify the existence of any possible players from YGGDRASIL. However, if there were none, then there was no need to wait out the long casting time for the spell. Having to stand immobile in the middle of a magic circle was quite uncool. During the battle with Shaltir, he did not have that luxury. Against the lizard men, he had not used an attack spell. Then, this will be fun. It's going to be fun. What exactly would a super tier attack spell do against the armies of the kingdom? Although it was not a particularly strong spell in YGGDRASIL, what effects would it have in this world? Suddenly, Ains knotted his non-existent brows. Many people were about to die, but he did not feel any pity for them, and it somewhat frightened him. He did not even feel cruel, like someone trampling ants to death. In truth, he felt nothing at all. There was only the desire to see the results of his actions. And of course, the benefits he would reap for himself for the great underground tomb of Nazarick. Ains clenched his fist. The particles of sand leaking from the shattered hourglass moved against the wind and flowed into the magic circle surrounding Ains. And then the super tier spell activated instantly. Tribute to the Black Bounty, Ia Shub Niggurath. A black wind blew, racing past the kingdom's army, which had just finished changing its formation. No, there was no physical wind blowing. Neither the scattered weeds growing on the plains or the hairs on the heads of the kingdom's soldiers had been touched. There were 70,000 men in the left wing of the kingdom's army. Every single one of them was slain in an instant.